Meet Jane. Like most of us, she's a school administrator. It is nearing the end of the year, and her students are getting antsy to leave for the summer. In the cafeteria, there was an incident involving several students, a verbal altercation resulting in a fight. Now what should Jane do? She has some choices. She can wait until after school and call his mother, letting her know that he's suspended. She could sign the suspension form and deliver it to his last hour. Or Jane could dig through her EDL 750 binder to find a court case that she can reference for help. What should she do? Then Jane remembers Goss v. Lopez from 1975. In 1971 in Columbus, Ohio, 9 secondary students were suspended for less than 10 days. These suspensions were from various incidents, ranging from refusal to leave an area when instructed, damaging or vandalizing property in a cafeteria, attacking a school resource officer, and causing a disturbance in front of an administrator. Students received suspensions as a consequence for violating school rules, though none of them were given a hearing prior to that suspension. Dwight Lopez and 8 other students brought a lawsuit against the administrators of the Columbus Public School System, as well as the director of pupil personnel. They're alleging that the school violated their 14th Amendment right to due process by failing to give them a hearing. The students sought declaratory and injunctive relief from their suspensions, asking the courts to rule in favor of their 14th Amendment rights. The 14th Amendment states no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Lopez and the other 8 wanted the courts to expunge their academic records and to rule in favor of their rights with no additional compensation. In 1973, the district court ruled in favor of Lopez and the other plaintiffs, declaring the Ohio statute and the Ohio Public School Administrative Code violated students' right to due process and deprived the students of property and liberty interests. The schools were directed to remove any mention of the disciplinary action from the school records, and the school district adopted fair suspension procedures. The case was then argued in front of the Supreme Court in 1974. A 5-4 decision upheld lower courts' ruling that the 14th Amendment rights of the students had been violated. The argument was that the Ohio Revised Code and existence of a compulsory attendance law make property interests legitimate for these students. In turn, suspensions up to 10 days violate both property and liberty interests. Whenever a student is in violation of school code resulting in a short-term suspension of 10 days or less, the duty of school leaders is to provide due process in the form of an informal hearing to the student. As Goss v. Lopez states, there need be no delay between the time notice is given and the time of hearing. Few constraints are put in place as a result of this decision: to provide verbal or written notice of the alleged infractions, to allow students to provide explanation of the events and refute the allegations. This may also include asking for additional resources such as witness statements or cross-examination of others if administrators feel necessary. Although a hearing is usually required before suspension, courts do allow students to be removed from the school immediately when they pose a continuing danger to persons or property or an ongoing threat of disruption. In such cases, notice and hearing would be given by an administrator or disciplinarian as soon as possible. Conducting short informal hearings prior to suspension allows students a chance to be heard and produce additional necessary facts an administrator may never have known. The administrator can then investigate these disputes. For the benefit of the student, they may then use discretion when involving other parties. These practices provide extra protection against erroneous actions. At this point, Jane should call her student down and discuss with him that he's being in violation of the Student Code of Conduct for a verbal and physical altercation. She then gives the student an opportunity to explain what happened. If Jane is confident the student understands these allegations, it is fair to assign a consequence of suspension. If Jane feels more information is needed, she will now investigate. To ensure that Jane is complying with the Goss standard for short-term suspensions, she should review her board policy and student handbook language to make sure it includes the following standards. First, before making the decision to suspend a student for 10 or fewer days, an administrator will provide the student with verbal notice of the offense and provide that student with an informal opportunity to explain the situation. In addition, the board policy and student handbook should also include that, except in an emergency situation, an administrator would not suspend a student unless, after providing the student with notice and an opportunity of explanation, the administrator is reasonably certain that the student had violated the Student Code of Conduct and that suspension is the appropriate consequence. Jane should be absolutely certain that suspension of the student fits the infraction and that all due process rights were intact. Removing a student from school for any length of time could be potentially damaging to their education. However, Jane must weigh the detriment to school safety and order if the student remains against that if the student is temporarily removed from the school. Jane wonders if the Goss decision covers all incidents that may occur. The guidelines set forth in the Goss decision are fairly generic, and since this 1975 decision, very few challenges have come forward before the courts. However, each scenario has been slightly different. In 2016, courts held that when a student was given the ultimatum of expulsion or confession and he replied, whatever, that the school did not violate his 14th Amendment rights. His lack of explanation was still considered due process, as the principal stated the allegations and consequence, giving him a chance to explain. Earlier, in a 1994 case, parents claimed the 14th Amendment violations for their 6th grade son who finished the last 10 days of school at home due to severe bullying and threats of violence. Parents felt their son's inability to be at the school being educated violated his property rights. The courts decided that by keeping the student home for his own safety and providing all classroom work to him, regardless of his refusal to complete it, the school followed due process guidelines and were not violating the 14th Amendment, property, or liberty interests of the student in question. Remember, the Goss standard does not necessarily apply to suspensions longer than 10 days or to expulsion procedures, as those can have different guidelines. However, Goss v. Lopez did state that longer suspensions and expulsions may require more formal procedures. This leaves the door open for further decisions in regard to scenarios outside the scope of short-term 10 days. The Goss v. Lopez decision did establish a new property right to students in terms of their constitutional right to public education, where states had done so in their own constitution and had established compulsory attendance laws. This is an added extra layer of protection for due process of students under the 14th Amendment. Jane now feels more confident in her decision to assign a short-term suspension to her student. She conducted a short informal hearing, listened to his explanation, and then imposed a consequence. Jane is relieved to know she did not violate the student's 14th Amendment rights, nor his property or liberty interests with this short-term suspension.